examined. So why did Shakespeare create Capulet? Firstly, we need to know that in the original poem, written by Brooke some 60 years before the play, Capulet wasn't such a villain. In fact, it was Lady Capulet's idea to get Juliet to marry Paris in the poem. Shakespeare changes that because he is attacking the patriarchal society. He's questioning the role of men. So the first point we're going to make is that Capulet represents what's wrong with patriarchal male society, and in particular, what's wrong with parenting in that society, because it's vitally important to Capulet, one, that Juliet remains a virgin, two, that he can marry her off to the best suitor, and three, those two things count towards making a really advantageous match for Capulet. He wants Juliet to marry into a super powerful family, a really wealthy family, because that raises his wealth and his status. And don't forget, he's in a bitter rivalry with another noble family, the Montagues, and he needs to get ahead of them. So our quotation number one goes straight in at that patriarchal level. So Juliet is not yet 14 years old. Now, you might not have been taught that this is actually a massive deal. It wasn't traditional in Shakespeare's time for people to get married young. Not at all. The average age of marriage in England at that time was mid-20s. So Shakespeare expects his audience to be horrified at Paris's request to be married so young. In the source poem, Juliet is 16, and Shakespeare changes that in order to show how evil this patriarchal society is. He's saying Capulet represents this wealthy, noble society as a whole. This makes him different, by the way, from Shakespeare, who got married at 18, to Anne Hathaway, who was already 26. So Shakespeare is not into the idea of young brides in any way. But let's focus on the language that Capulet uses, calling her ripe to be a bride. He's comparing her to a fruit, which is in a way quite distasteful. He objectifies her. He sees her as a commodity, something that he can trade to get the influence of Paris's wealth and family. But ripeness is also sensual language. We think about the texture and flavour of a fruit that's ripe. And so he's inviting Paris to think of his daughter in that flavourful, textured way. And so there's an element of sexuality there which we're not entirely comfortable with as an audience at Shakespeare's time. You know, he's basically selling his daughter's sexual attraction to Paris at the same time as he's telling Paris to wait. Now, we can see him as a more modern, in Shakespearean terms, a more modern parent asking this wonderful suitor to wait. However, there's a bit of gamesmanship going on here because he's also arranged this ball for Paris to come to. Now, he tells Paris, come and look at all the other beauties, but is that what he really means? In the second quotation, Paris again plays a really good father. He talks about her consent, something which we know he's going to go back on very soon, but at least he's talking this game to Paris. And we wonder how much of this is a pose and how much of this is what he really feels. An insight into that is he talks about those who are marred by being too early made into mothers. And shockingly, we later find out that Juliet's own mother was already pregnant and about to give birth when she was Juliet's age. This is incredible information which would have shocked a Shakespearean audience. When Capulet talks about young brides being turned into young mothers and therefore ruined, marred, is he speaking from experience? Did he ruin Juliet's mother by forcing her to have sex at such a young age and therefore become a mother? The relationship between Juliet and her mother is cold and distant and formal, which would suggest that this young mother did not know how to bond with her child and perhaps did not even want this child, Juliet. Our third quotation, with Capulet at the ball being confronted by Tybalt, determined to get rid of Romeo as an interloper, also reveals him to be quite reasonable. He tells Tybalt that he's not going to eject Romeo. He focuses on Romeo's virtue. Now, of course, this is ironic. We know Romeo's not virtuous because we've seen him bribing Rosalind with gold in order to have sex with her. He talks about saints seducing gold, and he's appalled that she doesn't take his bribe. So there's nothing virtuous about Romeo at the start. So this portrays Capulet either as ignorant or as wanting to appear reasonable and civilized at his own ball. After all, he's trying to get Paris into the family. He doesn't want any kind of brawl or violence or scandal right here and now, because that might ruin his wedding plans. Now we're going to jump forward to Tybalt's death. Every scene with Paris starts in media res, which means the conversation has been going on before the curtain goes up or before the scene starts, and we have to infer what's being said. Well, we can infer that Paris has been pressing Capulet constantly to let him marry Juliet. Now, he's used Tybalt's death to say that Juliet will be better off, she'll be able to take her mind off this tragedy by finding a new love in her life, i.e. Paris. Capulet is fertile ground for this. He wants Juliet to marry, and he can see this as an opportunity. We see how cynical this is when he talks about his love for Tybalt, and then he says, well, we were born to die, that's life. Let's crack on with real life and make some money. He's saying, hold on, this rush has meant I've not had time to get to Juliet to persuade her that she has to marry you. So he's asking to buy more time, but is in a day or two. He's not saying anymore, let's wait 2 more years till she's 16. Now we have the moment where Capulet becomes a villain. Now remember, he's not just a villain in himself, he represents a male attitude. In fact, Shakespeare takes him to a kind of stereotype where as a male, he refuses to indulge in emotion, as we just saw with the death of Tybalt. Now, Tybalt has been dead only 1 day, and he accuses Juliet of faking. He talks about her counterfeiting this storm in which her own body is a bark, a boat tossed on the storm of her own tears. So he's talking about her being deliberately melodramatic, showing far too much grief. Now, this might be true a week from now, where her grief is really about losing Romeo and not about losing Tybalt at all. But this is the very next day, and we would expect this level of grief. However, Capulet turns against her, as does his wife, and she talks about her tears and grief showing a want of wit. So both parents believe in controlling your emotions. So what we have here is Shakespeare using Capulet to criticise the lives of the upper classes of his day, of the nobility. And he's asking the rest of his audience perhaps to have a tiny little bit of sympathy for these narrow emotional lives that they lead. Because it's only the nobles who indulge in this practice of arranged marriage. And it's this obsession with family and power and wealth which Shakespeare is attacking and saying damages not just the victims like Romeo and Juliet, but also the perpetrators. So Capulet is damaged and Lady Capulet are damaged because they have such shrunken emotional lives. They're not able to experience life and family life fully because children are just a commodity. In our 6th quotation, we're seeing a change in Capulet that is violent and sudden and appears out of character. Now, firstly, Shakespeare needs to do this because he needs Juliet's position to seem desperate enough for her to consider suicide as a realistic solution to her predicament. But the inherent danger in that is that his sudden turn doesn't really make psychological sense. Now, to a modern audience, this is difficult. So if you've seen the Baz Luhrmann film, he decides to play Capulet as drunk at this stage, and he becomes an abuser of his wife physically and threatens to abuse Juliet. But it's really important to remember Shakespeare was having none of that. Capulet deliberately says, in fact, "My fingers itch." So he's saying to Juliet, look, I really want to hit you, but I'm not going to, because that's not the kind of father I am. All his violence is in the threats of what he's going to do to her emotionally and financially. He's not physically violent towards his daughter at all. Otherwise, that line, "my fingers itch," would not fit. Shakespeare's put it in deliberately. So what does he accuse her of? Well, he accuses her of being a traitor to her family. It's her duty as a daughter to marry the man that he picks for her. He has in fact picked an amazing match. I mean, Paris, all things being equal, is far superior to Romeo. Paris is a count, which is the equivalent of an earl, which means he's damn close to royalty, whereas Capulet and Montague are just lords. You know, they're noble, but they ain't high up in the pecking order when it comes to the king or queen. Paris is. Even better than that, Paris is really young, as Capulet points out. Capulet himself must be at least 50, as we found out in that conversation with his cousin just before the ball, where they're talking about a previous masked ball they went to, which was at least 30 years ago. So we know that he must have been 30 at the very youngest and probably well into his 30s when he married Juliet's mother. Now here, he's picked a youthful husband for Juliet, someone who's much younger, possibly only in his early 20s. That makes him a really special catch for the day. Now, we as an audience, of course, are horrified because Juliet is still so young, but in the context that Capulet lives in, it seems like he's been a magnificent parent and he can't understand why Juliet is suddenly refusing to do her duty and to appreciate how lucky she is. Well, Shakespeare's point is it's because Capulet's treating her as a commodity, not a human being. And we can see that dramatised when Capulet calls her baggage. She's just something for him to pass on. And if she's not going to marry, then she is useless baggage. She's adding nothing to the Capulet family. When he calls her green sickness carrion, he's basically describing her as like a vulture, an animal that feeds on corpses. In other words, he's suggesting that if she doesn't marry Paris, she's effectively killing off her own family and eating on her family's flesh. Now, of course, how much he means this is open to question, but we can certainly read it as serious in Juliet's mind. And it's crucial in this scene that Capulet does not let Juliet speak. She says, "Father, hear me but to speak a word," but he refuses. So that makes his threats seem more powerful and real to her, even though as an audience we might think that he's going too far with these threats and he wouldn't carry them out. Juliet doesn't believe that. Now, it's important to see how he describes Paris. I talked about him being this fantastic match. Now, we've looked at his noble parentage, we've looked at how youthful he is. Now he focuses on Paris's sexuality. He talks about him not just having honourable parts, as in he's honourable because he's noble, he's actually talking about him physically. And then he uses this word stuffed with. It's a very violent verb to put into this description. And it reminds us it's all about putting one thing inside of another and cramming it in when it doesn't fit. Now, this is a horrible allusion to the sexual image of Juliet having to have sex before she's ready. It brings us back to the idea that he used when he called Juliet not yet ripe. She's not ready for this marriage and he knows it. She's not physically ready, and yet he's going to make her go through with it, even though it could potentially be physically very damaging. Now, once Juliet comes back to him with the friar's plan to be polite to her father and pretend that everything's okay and then take her drink at night to feign death for 42 hours, Capulet is delighted. He thinks the marriage is going to go ahead, and he stays up at night with his wife and the nurse preparing for the feast. Shakespeare throws in an extraordinary detail. His wife says to him, you have been a mouse hunt in your time. And she says it almost jokingly. And she jokes with him that he won't be able to do it anymore now that his daughter's not around. So what is the mouse hunt? Well, it's being unfaithful. It's going out as the cat prowling for prey. In other words, she's saying to her husband, yes, you've often been staying out late at night, going off finding women to have affairs with. So there are three things here. 1, Capulet has affairs. 2, he's happy for his wife to know about it. 3, he's only stopping because he's nearly 50, so it's been going on all her married life. And that's an insight again into this early marriage. So he's married Juliet's mother when she was only 13, perhaps even 12, and she's been there only to breed, to have children for him. But for pleasure and companionship, he's going off and having affairs with other women while she was a child, who he's exploited by forcing her to give birth to his heirs. Shakespeare puts this in to attack the double standard where women are expected to remain virgins until they marry and then faithful, whereas men are expected not to remain virgins, and even once they're married, not to remain faithful. Remember, Juliet says to Romeo that she doesn't expect him to be faithful when they first meet, but she wants him to be. She doesn't expect him to be because that's not how males behave in this society. Next, Shakespeare wants us to focus on Capulet's reaction once he believes Juliet is dead. The language he uses to describe this death to Paris is extraordinary. Instead of telling Paris how sad he is that his own daughter is dead, he uses this really bizarre sexual imagery. He treats death as a lover who has been able to enjoy sex with Juliet before Paris can and then killed her so that Paris never can. In other words, Capulet is totally fixated on his daughter's sexual role. It's only through having sex with Capulet as a virgin in marriage that she'll be able to consummate this bond which made the alliance that he wanted. The other thing Capulet focuses on is Juliet's virginity. That's what flower and deflowered refers to. So what's really at the back of Capulet's mind here is he no longer has that virginity to trade. So this is obscene on 2 levels, isn't it? It's treating his daughter entirely as a sexual object and then treating her as that commodity to trade. And so he's not particularly upset that he's lost his daughter and her life. He's thinking about her market value and how he's lost that market value and can no longer trade it. He also expects Paris to be most upset not at Juliet's death, losing a wife, but losing Juliet's virginity and that opportunity to have been the first man to have had sex with her. Because that, again, is this idea of possession. The woman has to give something away and the man has to take it. In this way, Shakespeare, again, is attacking the whole mindset of this patriarchal society, which privileges male power so much in comparison to female power, desire, emotion, independence, and self-fulfillment. So our 10th quotation looks at Capulet reconciling with Montague. He talks about a jointure. This is the dowry. So even now at the end, he's still thinking about his daughter in financial terms. He's not just offering peace to Montague, he's offering it as the dowry that he would have had to pay to Romeo as the husband. So even in their grief at this moment, when Capulet and Montague realise that they've been the main cause of the suicides and deaths of their children, they're still wedded to this idea of the patriarchal society and this arranged marriage, which is so powerful that the reconciliation is still framed in terms of a dowry that the wife's father has to pay to the husband. So although society in Verona has been made better because there's now no feud, society at large is still as damaged as it ever was. And so Shakespeare's point is that Capulet lives on in the noble families, not just in Verona, but in his own country. And of course, in London, they would all have been sitting around in the top seats of the globe. That's where the nobles sat, and they would be looking down, and Shakespeare's hoping they'd be looking down and recognising an extreme version of themselves. And that is the point of the tragedy.